Hi guys, my name is Digara. Those who've watched my couple of my videos, past videos on Azure, will probably know that I record some couple of videos. So today I decided to record a video based on Azure durable functions, right? So you wonder why I have this wanky or weird looking frame around my face, but essentially this is the type of patterns that I'll be talking about. So what are durable functions? Durable functions essentially is, if you think about Azure functions, they're actually stateless in a sense, right? They are meant to execute a particular workload, be able to complete it without actually managing some sort of state or anything along those lines. So durable functions essentially bring in the state element back into Azure functions. It allows you to run functions in a stateless environment, but in a stateful manner, right? There's a couple of patterns that you can use on Azure durable functions through the orchestrator itself, and I'll explain what that is and how it works. But some of the patterns that are useful are essentially the one that you see below, which is function chaining. So think about it that you want to actually pass in input from one function to the next in a sequential manner, right? You kind of want to know that, cool, I've actually, from the diagram that we have below, I've actually executed function 2 and function 2, which is F1 and F2 and F3. I'm actually left with executing F4 in my particular process. So that's one of the patterns. The other one that you see on the other side, so the one in the bottom here, is essentially the one that basically deals with interactions that will require human interactions, or flows that will require human interaction. So things like, let's say for example, if you are working in a procurement kind of environment, you actually want a couple of approvals from the line manager or whatever the case might be. So those approvals will essentially follow this kind of pattern. Then this pattern that we have here essentially is the fan in, fan out. So you kind of have processes where, cool, you got one particular request, but then in this request you want to do or execute a bunch of transactions, right? Those bunch of transactions can run in parallel essentially. But at the end of the execution, you then want to get to all the results, or all the aggregated results for those particular processes to be basically stored as one output or processed as one output. So that's known as fan in, fan out essentially. Then the other one that you have there is HTTP async. So this one is a case where, let's say for example, normally you'd have processes that are running in external systems. Now you want your users to know whenever the function has completed executing, whether it was successful or not. Think about your payment gateways or whatever the case might be. That is taking it a little step further, but essentially that's the kind of logic where normally people would use, let's say, webhooks of some sort or whatever the case might be. So that's one of the patterns that you can actually use on durable functions to achieve more or less a similar kind of flow. So all of these patterns, as I mentioned previously, Azure has been wonderful enough to actually create these patterns for us. We don't really need to do a lot of coding in terms of the actual logic that goes into how do I know that function 2 is executed instead of function 3 in the request that I have below. Cool. Now what I'm gonna do is basically switch my presentation to the next level, and what I'll effectively do here is basically, like I do in all my videos, this is what Azure looks like. This is where you find most of your documentation. So everything that I'm speaking about, most of it is coming from this particular website here. It teaches you a bunch of information around this, and usually most of these things will have a page called an overview page, and it will tell you a bunch of things. Say for example here it tells you which language is supported and which version of Azure function actually supports that across the stack. Then the patterns that I was talking about, if you want to read through them, you can go through this website and it will tell you a bunch of information that you need in regard to actually implementing these functions themselves. Cool, not gonna waste any time. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna quickly go to Visual Studio, then I'm gonna say cool, I want to create an Azure function. Then my function, I'll call it durable functions, right? So what I'll do is I'll come here and basically say durable functions function recurring. Fine. That's fine. Then I'll click next. and I click next, Visual Studio will do some sort of magic. It will say cool, which language do you want to select? I don't really care about that much, so I'll just go .NET 6 and I'll create that. Well, different .NET versions have different support for this particular particular functionality that you can have in an Azure function. So what I'll then do is, this is the function that was recently created. I'm just gonna try and look at the function. So this is the function that they created out of the box from Visual Studio. It has a class here called function1, and the function1 has an HTTP function essentially, right? If I look at what this thing does is it goes to that and says cool, give me a property called name on the payload. So if I hypothetically go and run the project and basically starts up, triggers console. As it opens up the console, I'll just put it on screen and it says cool, here is your function, right? The function that you're looking at is that one, so I'll just quickly copy the URL, try open Postman somewhere. Okay, cool, this is going to clash with the presentation that I need to do further, but I'll come here and say cool, that's that. I'll go to my body, and on my body I'll just change that to that name, and I'll say cool, for argument's sake. Now let's try look at what this thing is doing in the background. So that's the function. I think I copied that. So the function itself, if you go to the code, it will say cool, do this. This is not the purpose of this video. Essentially, this video is now going around and just showing you how to create a function. And it says cool, hello Digarabo, this HTTP has been triggered successfully. I assume that's the message that they have there, but I don't really care about that function. I want to get into I want to get into durable functions. So in durable functions, I'll say cool, I'll call this my orchestrator function, right? My orchestrator function. Well, let's say for example you don't be triggered by HTTP, so we'll be triggering it using a different kind of trigger, and that trigger, depending on if you are running it in process or out of process, it will be different, right? So this one that I'm using particularly is for in process, so that is doing that, and it will say cool, install the package, and the package that you need to install. Then while it's installing that, I'll probably go back here and try and say cool. Okay, it doesn't like me doing that, so I will go that route and say cool, because I removed the request, so probably all this code must go away, right? So what do I need, or what can I get from context itself? So if I look at context, it was returning that, so I wanted to not return anything essentially, so that the error goes away. So if I click on context and I say dot, there's a bunch of methods that you can see here, or that you can call. Current etc time, we'll talk about that. Instance ID, we'll talk about what that is. It's replaying, that's a huge concept that we'll cover as well in this session. Cool, go for it. So currently we have that. Let's say for example this then does a simple console.log, and it will say okay, not in JavaScript, I must remember that. My Orchestrator executing, right? That's fine, nothing hectic. Then I'm like, okay, cool, now I've created that function of mine and I want it to execute, and I'm like, okay, cool, I run the function. I expect to see something on console, and I'm like, boom, where's my log message? What's going on? This is simply because you are actually not triggering the orchestrator itself, right? For the orchestrator to start working, what you effectively need is to go back and have a function that essentially triggers the orchestrator, right? When I do that, I'm just going to be lazy and say, cool, this thing is called another function. As I mentioned, the entry point, I'll call it trigger my orchestrator function, right? This one, we actually want it to be an HTTP request so that it does something, right? In the HTTP request, I don't really need the logger for now, but yeah, it's there. So it's an HTTP based kind of function. It will do something. So if I do that, and I easily say cool, triggering my Orchestrator trigger. Right. If I do that and I save and I go boom, so this function will expand in a bit. So I'm running that. It says function error ambiguous name match. The function. Okay, let me see. Where's the ambiguousness? Okay, cool. It will need me to basically, let's just do that, right? For clarity's sake, I'll just rename that as well. What is it complaining about? Okay, it lacks await. That's not a problem. And I'm like, okay, cool. What I wanted to show you guys was console. Now in console, if you go back on the video, you'll see that there was just this one function. Now there's this HTTP method. So if I go to the HTTP method and I go back to my Postman, oh no, I closed Visual Studio Debugger while copying, but it's not a problem. So while that is happening, I'll just go back here, paste the URL that I had, and make sure that my console is running. My console is running. Then once I click on send there, I expect something to be written. Triggering, okay, type of the triggering my orchestrator trigger. Cool, that's fine. So we effectively know that our code here is executing, right? So now we actually want to get to a point that we actually trigger this orchestrator function. Now how do we do that? Cool. Microsoft, as we mentioned on Azure and the support that we have for Azure functions, there's a bunch of interfaces that they include for us. So this is the durable context, durable orchestrator context. This is durable orchestrator or orchestration client, right? With the client, we can do much things, so a lot of things. So if you remember, a lot of people have the idea of saying, cool, I need, let's say, a blob client or whatever the case might be. The naming convention on Azure is technically close to, well, not close to one another, but they use similar naming conventions. So I'm going to say that, I will the client. Then on client, I want to create a new, okay, not create, but start new async, right? What am I starting? I'm actually starting my orchestrator. Boom, orchestrator, then do that. Then there's something called instance ID that I need to provide, right? And I'll show you guys what that, well, the role of that is. So I'm gonna say var instance ID is equals to my instance ID, right? My instance ID, that, and I'm gonna slap that in there. Then there's another property that you can pass in here. Essentially, you can pass in an input which is generic, so you can basically put in anything that you want in there, but I'm not going to put anything for now. I'll show you guys what that does. Cool. That is running. That well, it's not running yet, it has that. Then what's this method? Just give me a second. Okay, cool. So once you've actually created once you've actually created that particular instance, you kind of want to respond to the user and say, cool, yeah, user, this is actually what you have in that. So I'm gonna say cool, that return client dot create, okay, typo client dot create check status response, right? What does this do? It basically says, cool, give me a a status update of what I just created. And how do I know that it's what I just created? Because I use that instance ID. So this will effectively respond with a it will respond with a status of that particular orchestration that I started. So I'm gonna say Google HTTP, if I can type HTTP response message, response message. I'm probably missing HTTP response message. Message. Feels like I have a type of some sort. Can't figure it out. I can say iAction if I wanted to. iAction results. It's not a big deal. Al doesn't really like that much. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just copy paste this, and that's effectively what I have. Alright, so this is my actual orchestrator, and this is my trigger orchestrator function. Right, makes sense? Cool. So what I'll then do is just start up my instance again, and I'll show you guys what happens. Console, nothing much that is going on, and while it does that, I'll just leave it as that, and what will happen is you will see that I actually trigger that. Right, when I trigger that, it then goes and says cool, my orchestrator executing, my trigger orchestrator triggering. So if I go there and I say cool, and I put a breakpoint there, what you guys will effectively see is if I run this, it will then say cool, that is running, there's a breakpoint. On my breakpoint, it actually goes to my orchestrator and tries to do that. So if I go to context, just for context purposes, if I go to non-public, there's a bunch of information in there, right? Remember the instance ID that I was telling you about, there it is, guys, and execution ID, there's a bunch of information that I'm gonna skip, but essentially your execution ID will come into it just now. So cool. And what else? Okay, there's this concept of is replaying. So the concept of is replaying is the orchestrator can run multiple times. So if there's a replay of some sort, it will try basically re-execute, and I'll cover that concept as we go along. Cool, my orchestrator is running. Then with my orchestrator running, what can I really do, right? What you can do is, if you look at the code itself, there's a bunch of things. I did a console write. You can say cool, I want to actually orchestrate, right? And how do you orchestrate? You say let's say for example in our process you say I want to call shouldn't be doing this, call a function that writes my name, call a function that writes my surname, and I'm gonna say call a function that retrieves my date of birth. I'm not gonna use my actual date of birth there, but essentially that's what our orchestrator should be doing. You'll say cool, I'll orchestrate between this function and this function using some sort of input. Right, makes sense. So this is an orchestrator running. Then I'll probably have to have a bunch of other functions that needs to use that orchestrator function. This has taken way too much time than I had intended. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna stop the video. After stopping the video, I'll just create another video, basically continue from here. But the concepts that we've covered is an entry function, so a trigger function that will be able to trigger our orchestrator, and this is how we trigger our orchestrator. The response that I was talking about that we needed to see was effectively that check status is what you see on Postman, and nope, don't do that. Don't save. But if you look at this, it says call your instance ID called my instance. There's a bunch of things that you can do. You can check the status of it, you can send an event, you can terminate the actual thing, or page or delete the actual history of that particular function, and so forth. So these are effective URLs that you can basically trigger to get whatever state that you wanted, right? I could do this. Terminate post, it is probably a post method. If I do that and I say that, let's see what it does. It says full 410. This thing is gone, so probably something has happened to it. Cool. I'm gonna close that and we'll meet on the next video.